Okay, hello again. This week we are going to be talking on Invisible Cannons about Black Chrysanthemums by Angela Fuster. There we go. So this is one of the Yakandanda plays, so you know that it's late 70s, early 80s. Angela Fuster was a playwright from sort of late 70s into the sort of mid 80s. She was an Adelaide-based playwright. She might still be Adelaide-based, I'm not entirely certain. She was a fairly young playwright at the time. She'd worked with Carclew in Adelaide and also Troupe. She'd had Shopfront do readings of her works, and she'd had a couple of shows on by the stage that she'd written Black Chrysanthemums, and this got a reading at the ANPC conference in, I think, 1981, and was eventually performed at Nimrod downstairs in 82, and also in Melbourne and at the ANU. Yeah, at the ANU. It's set in 1860 in an abandoned goldfield town called Bell Creek. It tells the story of two sisters, Tip and Nell, both in their early to mid-20s, who have been waiting in their shanty for their father to come home. Their father is a drover, a gold miner, a prospector, and he has left them 6 months beforehand to go to Bendigo to look for gold, and promised that he would come back. 6 months later, Tip, the youngest, is fairly convinced that he is not coming back and desperately wants to leave and is planning on leaving Bell Creek, whereas Nell, the older sister, is more housebound, is determined to wait for their father to come back, and has some, not exactly attachment issues, but it is definitely much more emotionally available and open than Tip is. Tip is all tough and hard, full of offhand kind of comments, and is very distant. Keeps her sister at a distance, keeps everyone else at a distance. She's a strong character, certainly, but she comes across as careless. She comes across as blunt and rude and uncaring. And a lot of the play between the two sisters is about the fact that they squabble, they bicker, and, well, they're both really capable of being cruel to each other, as siblings are wont to be sometimes, I suppose. There isn't a great deal of movement in the story. Basically, in the first half, they are waiting for their father to return. Instead of their father, one of their father's old mates, Soursop Sam, an old drover who brings stories of their father to them, and sort of encourages them to move on, which it gives them at least a sort of sense of hope that he might be coming home soon. And then by the second act, a newer friend of their father's, Frankie, arrives carrying the body of their father, who has died on the way to come back for them. So he was intending to return, and he only died that morning, and so Frankie has brought the body back to the girls to bury. This, of course, gives Tip no reason to stay, and Nell, who clearly has abandonment issues, goes into a kind of sort of total breakdown, as would be understandable. You only just discovered that your father has died, who you've been waiting for 6 months in this abandoned town, and now your sister is leaving you as well. She feels trapped. She feels unable to leave. She doesn't know how to get. Doesn't feel confident, I think, enough to go on her own. And so she wants Tip to take her. Tip won't take her. She wants Frankie to take her. Frankie and Nell develop a physical relationship while he's there, fairly quickly, if you ask me. But he's not interested in taking her. He seems like he's a younger prospector, and mainly he seems like he's had his way with her, and now he's moved on to wanting Tip instead, and offers to take Tip with him to Bendigo. She refuses, even though they're going to be going the same way and leaving on the same day, and on the horses that he rode in on. So given that she goes and leaves Nell, and we don't really see what happens to Nell afterwards, honestly, it feels like a play in which Nell is kind of the punching bag for the world, and is surrounded by fairly cruel people and cruel circumstances. It's, even though it's set in the 1860s, it's got a really kind of 1980s feel to it, an early kind of 1980s feel to it. It's got that kind of punk attitude to the writing. It doesn't it doesn't attempt to emulate the language of the 1800s, but it does have a punky and kind of gobby, or mouthy, I should say, attitude to the way it's written, particularly Tip. Tip kind of comes off as the rough and tumble Aussie kid, a kind of tomboy sort of character, although you never really see her doing anything particularly tomboyish. It's just in her manner. But at the same time, Tip is sweary and brutal in a way that reminds me of late 70s, early 80s punk in Australia. The play itself keeps reminding me of Sam Shepard. It sort of reminds me of Cowboy Mouth. Again, a very different sort of play, but the same kind of attitude. You can feel that the plays are breathing the same air. The Black Chrysanthemums of the title is related to a story that Nell tells Tip early on about seeing white chrysanthemums, or that their mother had loved white chrysanthemums before she died. She dies early on in their life, long before we encounter them. And Tip's never heard of them, thinks they sound like a disease, thinks the word chrysanthemum sounds like a disease. And so Nell describes them as a kind of beautiful, fragile, white English flower. To which Tip responds by saying, well, I mean, they couldn't possibly have been here. Nothing like that would survive here. To survive here, you'd need black chrysanthemums, which is a kind of undertone throughout the play that is not really about the relationship with the local Indigenous people or anything like that, but demonstrates the kind of 80s sensibility of the arts community at the time. Seems like it's supportive of the community, of the First Nations people in the narrative, even though none of them ever appear. They're only ever referred to. They're only ever outside of the actual play itself. They're outside of town, and they come up occasionally because Tip has a habit of disappearing and wandering off down to the local Indigenous camp, and prefers to be... Nell at least says that she prefers to spend time with them than her. And indeed, when Soursop Sam makes what is actually a racist comment, Tip stands up for them and defends the community. It's certainly not a straight naturalistic play, and so there are things like the convenient nature of Frankie turning up with the dead body of their father, having only died that morning. It collapses time into itself. It's not important that it seems to a skeptical eye like, oh well, that's convenient. Instead, it's simply about it's functional. The body of their father needs to be returned and buried to kind of unlock the prison they've gotten themselves into. Nell trapped there because she can't leave on her own, and Tip trapped there because despite her protestations of hating her sister and wanting to kill her, and also being afraid that Nell's planning on killing her as well, despite all that, she's still anchored to her sister through what is clearly a kind of sisterly love or family bond that, while she's not prepared to admit it, she still clearly kind of feels it. Which doesn't stop her leaving, I might add. So it is a play of kind of loneliness and cruelty. And in places the dialogue would need work. It has not necessarily aged super well for contemporary political sensibilities. But there is a lot to be said about it, actually. Again, two really good roles for women in it, two central roles for women in it. Nell has so many kind of emotional issues, and even though she is the oldest, and it seems like she is more mature, more in control, is clearly a mess of roiling emotions underneath, whereas Tip, there's a great swagger to the character of Tip, which I think also belies a kind of fragility to her as well. These would be amazing characters to play. The dialogue itself, not only are there moments where it's kind of contemporarily problematic, it's quite sparse in places, and so it reflects a lot of the Australian mythos of the bush, and particularly even with both the characters, both the girls, it takes the stoic nature of the Australian bush myth, the one that's usually associated with the men of the outback, the taciturn, not willing to commit oneself to anybody, not willing to get too emotional or to show too much emotional dependence, to not talk about things that are bothering you, instead to bottle them up inside. Those things are kind of wonderfully portrayed by the two girls in Black Chrysanthemums. It is a good play. It doesn't immediately grab you as being, I think, a classic, but there is a great deal of space in here to do a lot with it, I think. So it would make a really interesting contemporary revival, I think. And it's certainly worth searching out and having a read.